So if everybody could take their seats, we're going to get started. Good evening. Thank you all for coming inside on such a glorious evening. My name is Lisa Servan, and I'm Dean of Milano, the New School for Management and Urban Policy, and also the New School for General Studies. The Center for New York City Affairs in Milano inaugurated the city's Respond to Climate Change series a little under 2 years ago, thanks to a very generous grant from our underwriter, Con Edison. Our goal was to shine a spotlight on how New York and other cities are approaching climate change issues and to explore what lessons New York and other cities can learn from each other. The series fits squarely within the center's and Milano's larger mission to promote policy innovations that strengthen neighborhoods and improve urban life. The center specializes on the issues of public education, child and family services, immigrants, urban politics, and strategies for building stronger communities. At Milano, we work very hard to bridge the gap between academic theory and practice. We involve our students in hands-on policy work from their first year here, sometimes their first semester, engaging them directly with organizations and agencies working to create change, both locally and internationally. Our students leave Milano with a firm footing in the professional worlds of policy and management, as well as a profound understanding of the theories and forces that shape the world. One of the ways that the New School ties theory and practice together is through the public policy forums put on by the Center for New York City Affairs. These forums bring together local leaders and innovators to create meaningful dialogue about the pressing urban policy issues confronting New York City today. A Milano education which integrates theory and practice prepares our alumni to be especially effective in the urban policy arena. At Milano, we teach the skills that lie at the intersection of policy and implementation, and the skills that managers need to improve their organizations and better serve urban communities. And in the spirit of lifelong learning that our students learn while they're here, I think many of them are here tonight. If you're a Milano alum, could you raise your hand? So thanks for coming back. And so for all of these reasons, I can't think of a better place than Milano for tonight's conversation, and a better partner than Con Edison to make it happen. Today's topic is about our future and the ways in which we can address the environmental threats to our climate. It's about locating the leadership where it exists and supporting it to drive effective policy solutions. As we'll hear more about tonight, dynamic and cutting-edge policies and programs are happening in every sector and in cities all over the world. We're fortunate this evening to have featured speakers who are thought leaders on climate solutions, from the philanthropic community, as leaders of government agencies, research institutes, non-governmental organizations, and as elected officials. So we're now 6 months past the climate talks in Copenhagen, which were considered to be largely unsuccessful in developing a long-term plan for climate solutions. With an international plan that's truly struggling to evolve, an administration that's wavering on its environmental priorities, finding solutions to climate change at a local level is more important than ever. Tonight, we will discuss the role of government and whether or not current local policies are strong enough to matter, whether there's a profit motive for business to drive substantial change, and the ways in which we can work together across sectors to develop new best practices for effective change. This evening, we're going to look a little more deeply at all of these issues and why this is such a critical problem for all of us to address. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge some very special people in the audience. First of all, I want to thank Con Edison for underwriting the city's Respond to Climate Change series and tonight's program, and for enabling the Center and Milano to probe these issues, foster solutions, and share the knowledge that I hope we'll gain tonight with our students, alumni, and faculty, and with leaders from every sector, and with the interested public. 4 officials from Con Edison are with us tonight. Rebecca Kraft is Director of Energy Efficiency. Rich Miller is the Director of the company's Energy Market Policy Group. David Gamak is Director of Public Affairs, and Francis Rashevsky is Senior Vice President of Public Affairs at Con Edison. Will you please join me in giving both Francis and Con Edison a round of applause for being so forward-thinking and so generous in underwriting this series. In addition to underwriting this program, Con Edison has also extended its generosity further to establishing a scholarship fund at Milano to support the professional education of a new generation of leaders in the area of urban sustainability. The names of the Con Edison scholars, including both current students and our alumni, are listed in your program, and 4 of them are with us tonight. So now I'd like to ask Nicole Letelier, Nicole Rodriguez-Leach, Edward Smith, and Jennifer Trapinski to stand up. Will you please join me in acknowledging them as well? Next, I'd like to acknowledge a few other friends and supporters in the audience. Alyssa Drayton, who's a member of the Milano Dean's Council and is also with us. Sam Marks of the Deutsche Bank Americas Foundation, a very generous supporter of the Center for New York City Affairs. Nancy Rudolph is also with us, Mark Willis, a former member of our board, and his wife Carol, and Emily Yusuf, an alumna, a member of our board of governors and the chair of the Dean's Alumni Council, is also here. Please join me in applauding each of them along with Con Edison and all of Milano's fabulous supporters. So lastly, one housekeeping item. I want to let you know that after tonight's keynote address and panel discussion, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience, as we like to do to make this a really engaging and participatory experience. So there'll be staff members carrying microphones around the room, and if you have a question, you can raise your hand at that point and summon one of your staff. I'm now delighted to introduce our next speaker, Frances Wrzeszewski. Frances's biography and the biographies of all of our speakers are in your program, and so if you haven't met her or heard of her before, you've probably noticed that she's had and continues to have quite a remarkable and distinguished career. Among her many accomplishments, she's been a force in both city government and the private sector, practicing what we preach, which is that it's important to learn about and cross the sectors in your career. And her community service over the years has included membership on quite a few nonprofit boards. And so she's someone who's been very engaged in all 3 sectors and who very much understands the importance of those sectors working together in enabling New York City and New Yorkers to thrive. And this perhaps is one of the reasons why she's been such a wonderful friend and partner to Milano and such a forward-thinking patron to our students. Please join me in welcoming Frances to the podium.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. On behalf of the 15,000 men and women of Con Edison, we are pleased to support this evening's discussion. I think all of you will agree that our city, our region, and our nation face many social and economic challenges. While all of these challenges are important, it is equally important that we continue to make environmental issues a top priority. Previously, this forum has addressed the topic of energy efficiency and the role we play in reducing pollution. Tonight, we focus on the issue of environmental leadership. As a responsible corporate citizen, Con Edison will play a leading role in meeting the environmental challenges ahead. We have some accomplishments I'd like to report to you tonight, too. As of now, 40% of the company vehicles are on alternate fuel technology. We have more than 150 hybrid vehicles. During the past 5 years, we have reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by 36%, have installed a white roof on our corporate headquarters and on 20 other buildings, and a green roof on our learning center with more than 21,000 plants. Last year, we recycled more than 59,000 tons of materials, over 90% of our non-hazardous waste. And recently, we were recognized by the federal EPA for industrial material recycling. I am pleased to note that New York City region is already a leader in reducing CO2 emissions and in providing energy efficiency programs. However, we have not seen consensus across regions or among national leaders on how best to address climate change, and similar disagreements exist at the international level. A successful strategy to address climate change will require the engagement of all sectors of the economy. And as the Dean noted, we're lucky tonight to have private, public, and not-for-profit presence, both in the room and with our speakers. Together, we may begin to find the answers we need. Again, I thank everyone for coming, and I especially thank our speakers for bringing their unique perspective to this critical discussion. I hope you will find the conversation enlightening and thought-provoking. I invite you to learn more about saving energy and how you can help the environment in the future by visiting our Power of Green page on Facebook. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Francis. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Stephen Heintz, president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, our keynote speaker. As with Francis, his biography is in your program, so I won't summarize all of his work, but let me point out a few of the highlights that led Milano to think of him as an ideal guest speaker when we first conceived the Cities Respond to Climate Change series about 3 years ago, and made us so delighted that he accepted our invitation and is joining us this evening. As a leader in the nonprofit and public sectors, Mr. Heintz has shown innovation and creativity in his work at RBF. Since 2001, he has led the foundation in providing resources and capital to contribute to a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. For over 5 years, RBF has devoted 100% of its attention inside the Sustainable Development Program to climate and energy issues. In New York, RBF has been a key partner in the implementation of Plan YC. We are very fortunate to have Mr. Heintz with us today to provide his thinking on this critical issue, so please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for that very gracious and kind introduction. Thank you all for being here to have a conversation about the climate when you could be outside enjoying it at its very best. And my thanks to this very distinguished panel that has joined us tonight for this conversation. What I'm going to try to do in my remarks is just to kind of very quickly, because I really want us to get to the discussion, frame a few issues that I think may be of use for our conversation. I want to say first, though, how terrific it is that we have a school in New York City like the Milano School. I think it's so important, and you will hear this theme in my remarks, that we are training the next generation of leaders for service in the nonprofit sector, for service in policymaking, and for work in business. Because increasingly, and this is really the overarching theme of my point of view, we will not solve the climate crisis or many other of the very deep challenges we face looking out in this century unless these three sectors, public, private, and nonprofit, find a new way to work together while maintaining their unique and independent role in society. It's very exciting that we have a school like this, and it's also, in my view, because urban policy, which is a core of the curriculum here, is urgent policy, as increasingly the future of our cities, as Mayor Robertson will attest, is really the future of our world. Now, this is going to be a conversation about climate as one way of thinking about this new style of leadership and the new way that we need to organize our sectors to work together. And in my view, this is the most pressing challenge now facing humankind. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion with our panel. I think you will find that we have some different views among us and different perspectives to bring to this conversation, and I hope that you all will join in the question and answers and really draw out the expertise that is represented in this panel. But let me be clear at the outset about my own view. Despite recent flaps about some scientific research and reporting, the preponderance of scientific evidence is overwhelmingly clear. The planet is warming at an alarming rate, and human activity is largely responsible. Science has proven that if we carry on with business as usual, catastrophe, and that's a strong term, and I use it advisedly, catastrophe is inevitable, and in terms of the planet, just around the corner. If global warming continues unabated, we will see prolonged droughts, crippling heat waves, and increasingly severe storms and floods. All of these will in turn lead to the spread of disease, interruptions in food supplies, the potential of hundreds of millions of climate refugees from the developing world, and the possibility even of military conflict and significant economic losses. In my view, the only really serious remaining debate is not about the science, but it is about the severity and the timing of these impacts of inaction. If we are going to avoid catastrophic climate disruptions, we are going to need to discard anachronistic assumptions, break down outmoded organizational structures, and create a new global system that ensures planetary sustainability while also generating greater social and economic equity. In my view, so much is wrapped up in this that it really is about the future not only of our environment, but of our economy and of our society and of our experience on this planet as a human community. Most scientists now agree that we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by approximately 80% by the year 2050. This is a hugely challenging task. Some would say maybe not even possible, but this is what the consensus of science tells us we must strive to do. If we're going to accomplish it, we're going to need radical changes in economics, in public policy, in business, in international cooperation, and in human behavior. Dr. Jim Hansen, NASA's chief climate scientist, tells us that we probably have less than 10 years to act in order to avoid the worst of the consequences of climate disruption. Now, on one hand, cities are a big part of the climate problem. They are home to half the world's population, and they consume over 2/3 of the world's energy. In total, cities account for more than 70% of global CO2 emissions. And the challenges will grow dramatically in the decades ahead as the global urban population increases from 3.2 billion today to some 5 billion in 2030. In the decades ahead, Asia alone will be home to some 10 hypercities with populations in excess of 20 million. Cities will also experience the effects of climate change more acutely than many suburban and rural areas. Many of the world's major cities, including our own, are at risk of flooding from rising sea levels. Heat-trapping urban landscapes increase ambient temperatures and reduce air quality. In the developing world, 1 out of every 3 urban dwellers lives in a slum, making them particularly vulnerable to the health and environmental risks posed by climate change. On the other hand, however, I believe cities are key to the future of climate action. And here I want to congratulate Mayor Robertson for the extraordinary leadership in the city of Vancouver. And he will tell you more about the programs that they have put in place which are reducing greenhouse gas emissions and saving the city money and keeping the economy going along in very tough times. The concentration of population in cities allows for gains in efficiencies in areas like transportation and utility use. Cities are at the cutting edge of research in universities like this one, and they are incubators for new ideas and new programs and new policies. And they have the concentration of leadership, the theme again of this conference, in the business sector, in the public sector, and in the nonprofit and philanthropic communities to work together to try to pioneer new solutions to this problem. Moreover, bold new urban policies like congestion pricing can complement global climate policies like cap and trade to reduce energy demand and greenhouse gas emissions while lowering the overall cost of emissions abatement. Cities that act to build resilience to climate change also increase the security of their populations to the threats of rising sea levels and ever-increasing and more violent storms and weather activity. This increases security and the quality of life and makes cities the natural place for people to live and work. As the Dean was referring to earlier, in recent years, in the absence of meaningful federal policy in the United States on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, cities across the country have decided they just can't wait. They've got to do it on their own. They've got to get started. They have to simply begin the practical steps of taking carbon out of the atmosphere. It is no surprise that these battles to mitigate the effects of climate change and to move to a more sustainable economy are taking place at the local level, where politicians are closer to their constituents and the effects of environmental decline are more acutely felt. Mayors and other local officials have long understood the benefits of trying to move toward a green economy and are taking measures to increase the energy efficiency of infrastructure like buildings, outdoor lighting, and transportation systems. And as our hosts and generous benefactors from Con Ed have described, you can do this while still returning on the investments that you've made and producing a stronger economy. And this is the win-win that can happen from smart climate and energy policy. And I want to thank Con Ed for the work that it's been doing and the leadership that it has shown and for the help in supporting this series here at Milano. Mayors are also finding out that they can recover energy from solid waste, they can produce clean energy at the district level, and they can source energy, renewable energy at a larger scale from regional activity and regional suppliers. There are hundreds of examples. Vancouver is one, Chicago is another. Chicago has done some extraordinary work of looking at climate risk and climate opportunity and planning for the future in a way that is transforming the economy of that city. Portland, Oregon, another, where there have just been huge advances in giving the citizens of that city many, many more options in terms of how they travel to work and to other places within the city and reducing the dependence on automobiles. In fact, there are 1,000 mayors across the United States who have signed a public pledge to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in their cities in a way that is consistent with the goals of the Kyoto Protocol. So this is becoming a movement, and it's not Democrats. It's Democrats and Republicans. It's conservatives and liberals. It's in big towns and small ones. It's people realizing that this is healthy for their cities. It produces a higher quality of life. It is good for the future of the economy, and it will help prevent the worst of these climate disruptions that we can now expect without action. Cities across the globe are also taking action. To accelerate the response of the world's largest cities, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund joined with other donors to help support the second global World Cities Climate Summit, which took place here in New York City in August of 2007. Coming out of this summit is a new organization called the C40. These are the 40, some of the top cities around the world who are now working together, sharing their experience, learning from each other, learning from resources brought to them by others about how they can continue on this path of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving their economies and saving money in public budgets. The C40 initiative is now permanently housed at the Clinton Foundation, which supplies expertise and connects people in ways that the Clinton Foundation has proven so effective at doing. At the RBF, we've also long supported the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, a group called ICLEI, which is a global association of local governments that have made a commitment to sustainable development. ICLEI, too, provides technical assistance to its members, training and information services, connection to theory, connecting theory and practice, another theme of the Milano School, and helping mayors from cities all across the world in the development and implementation of climate plans. Now, as a loyal New Yorker, I admit I'm biased, and I happen to think that one of the best municipal plans anywhere in the world is Mayor Bloomberg's Plan YC. And as Lisa mentioned, in full disclosure in her introduction, the RBF has been deeply involved with the city in both the development of the plan and in its implementation, and we have funded citizens groups to keep the advocacy going because we know that between, as T.S. Eliot once said, between the rhetoric and the reality falls the shadow. And the question is, we have to keep pressure on in order to get these very good ideas in the plan implemented and actually into action. The report card that was issued last year suggests that there's been some really good progress in implementing Plan YC. There have been a number of notable achievements, including the opening of the New York City Office of Environmental Remediation, the launching of 20 stormwater retention pilot projects, the acquisition of significant tracts of land for the protection of the city's water supply, and the leveraging of nearly $261 million in federal stimulus funding for transportation and other green projects in the city. In addition, several important retrofitting programs have been initiated with major emitters like the Staten Island Ferry and the city's yellow taxi fleet. And these projects will significantly contribute to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and better air quality for New Yorkers. Of course, there have been some significant setbacks as well, most notably the failure of the New York State Legislature to approve the city's plan for congestion pricing, even though I think the benefits across all 5 boroughs were pretty clear. I remain convinced that congestion pricing remains a really good way of helping to reduce the city's traffic problems and reduce greenhouse gas emissions while also generating new revenues for our resource-starved transit system. And I hope that congestion pricing will be urgently reconsidered in the nearest future. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund has been engaged in the climate change debate on the international, national, state, and municipal levels for the past 15 years. Today, as Lisa suggested, work on climate change is our top priority as a global foundation and the single largest portfolio of our grant making. In addition to our work here in our home city, we are supporting climate action in cities and states all across the country. We are working in China, which is now the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, and there we are working both on demonstration projects of local energy conservation and at the national level to try to improve relations between the US and China as they try to collaborate together in the global climate negotiations, both leading up to Copenhagen and now leading up to Cancun later this year. We're also working with think tanks, advocacy groups, and governments in the developing world to strengthen their capacity to participate in the global climate debate and negotiations. It is absolutely essential that as we look to solve the global dimension of this problem, we do it in a way that provides real equity between the developed world, which has created the problem, and the developing world, which is going to feel it in many cases most acutely. We are living in terribly turbulent times. And I agree with something that Peter Drucker once wrote, which is, he said, the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence. It is to act with yesterday's logic. It was yesterday's logic of unrestrained use of fossil fuels that has caused the climate crisis we now face. But the work underway here in New York and in Vancouver and in cities and states and countries across this globe is creating and pioneering a new logic. And this is the logic of what I call low-carbon prosperity. The goal of low-carbon prosperity takes as its premise that emissions reductions and economic vitality are not mutually exclusive. Low-carbon prosperity will result from policies and practices that generate economic and employment growth along with the sustainable development of communities and businesses. The overarching challenge of our time is to create prosperity that values innovation and efficiency along with conservation in the use of scarce natural resources. The core elements of this low-carbon revolution are pretty clear. We must adopt pricing mechanisms that make dirty energy expensive and rapidly ramp up energy conservation efforts. We must make clean energy cheap and abundant. We need to cushion the economic impact on low-income communities and displaced populations. We need massive investments in green technologies and in the infrastructure necessary to deliver energy generated from renewable resources like wind and solar to the consumers. This is the so-called smart grid. The good news against this chilling view of what the future might be, the good news is that bold action taken in the next several years can both avoid the most dire scenarios and create the new economy of the 21st century. We can achieve low-carbon prosperity with millions of new green jobs, the economic benefits and savings that come from energy conservation, the reduced necessity for massive investments in adaptation to climate change, and recovery from climate disasters like Hurricane Katrina. In 2006, Sir Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist for the World Bank, issued a major study for the British government that concluded that the benefits of strong and early action on climate change would considerably outweigh the costs. In an update published in 2008, Stern estimated that an investment of 2% of global GDP per annum will be required in order to prevent the worst effects of climate change, but that failure to act, failure to make that 2% per annum investment could result in a drop of global GDP by as much as 20%. In recent years, numerous companies have seen enormous opportunity in the low-carbon revolution. An analysis issued at the end of last year by HSBC indicated that total revenues in 2008 in businesses selling low-carbon goods and services exceeded revenues to the aerospace and defense industry worldwide. They also project that by 2020, the green sector could grow to $2 trillion. And that's without the policy framework in place that would actually stimulate additional growth beyond that. We are living in a world that is more interdependent than ever before. And the reality of global interdependence is that people all across the world will experience the profound challenge of climate change, albeit in different ways and with variable intensity. Finding solutions to the climate crisis and achieving low-carbon prosperity is going to require innovative new forms of broader and deeper global cooperation among nations, peoples, and the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. I don't think we can meet this challenge if these three sectors in society continue to operate in the way that we have up until now, which has largely been very individualistic and often adversarial. We need to maintain the essential independence of each sector. Each sector brings great strengths to our society, but we must recognize that all three sectors are, in fact, essential to the vitality of our society, to the vibrancy of our economy, and to the goals of our democracy. To really move forward on this issue, the three sectors need to find a new modality of working together that complements the strengths and weaknesses of each sector. What business can bring to this is innovation and capital and delivery capacity. What government needs to bring to this is a policy framework that creates a level playing field for business. What the nonprofit community can bring to this is the advocacy that helps people change human behavior that is also necessary and helps force the political change, because at the end, this is not a scientific challenge. It is not even a technical challenge. It is, in fact, in great measure, a challenge of political will. And here the nonprofit community has a large role to play in the advocacy, in the public organizing, in the debate, in the forums like this one tonight. This must, in fact, be nothing short of a whole of society effort if we are going to achieve this goal. We will need dynamic leaders in all three sectors who are prepared to profoundly alter the status quo. And one of the things I like about the Milano School is that you are training those kinds of leaders for all three sectors going forward. And I hope that the education they get here and the relationships and the networks that they forge here will be put to work in the years ahead in helping us find the new way that we're going to solve this problem. We're going to have to do this at a scale that has never been done before. We're going to have to marshal the resources of all three sectors, not only in creative ways, but in bigger ways. Politicians, scientists, engineers, business leaders, economists, environmentalists, advocates, we're all going to have to work together to solve this defining challenge of our time. I think there's a clear path ahead. It's not an easy one. And the question is, will we act? Or will we, in the words of the poet William Butler Yeats, be stricken by the injustice of the skies for punishment? Thank you very much.
It's an ominous choice. Thank you very much. So now it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, David Owen. David has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1991, writing about the environment and other subjects. And his most recent book is Green Metropolis: Why Living Smaller, Living Closer, and Driving Less Are Keys to Sustainability, which grew out of a widely discussed 2004 New Yorker essay called Green Manhattan. We're truly glad to have him today, here with us today to guide this discussion. So come on up, and I think it's time for the panelists to come up. Yeah, great. Good stuff.
Thank you. Take your seats, panelists. This is a good place to hold this event. Manhattanites have the smallest carbon footprints of any Americans, and New York City is one of the very few, maybe even the only place in North America where walking is still a primary mode of transportation, not true anyplace else. I want to introduce briefly the members of the panel. Stephen Heintz, I think you probably remember from a minute ago.
Maybe not.
Gregor Robertson, who is not the president of the Student Council, but is the mayor of Vancouver.
Might be both.
Very jealous, although not for the job. David Kreutzer, who is a research fellow in energy economics and climate change at the Heritage Foundation Center for Data Analysis. Michaela Crator, who is the executive director of Sustainable South Bronx, which is an organization dedicated to creating environmental justice through innovative, economically sustainable projects informed by community need. And at the end, Frank Murray, who is the president and chief executive officer of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And he has extensive experience in energy and development, environmental issues spanning the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And I think I would begin by asking the panelists to take turns reacting to anything they would like to in Stephen Heintz's speech, and suggest one or two topics. In 2008, we saw something that not even the most optimistic environmentalists had been expecting, which was an actual reduction worldwide in global carbon output and energy use. And the cause was the rapid rise in the price of oil, along with the implosion of the global economy. And it's not a surprising link. When energy is more expensive, we use less of it. When people have lost their jobs or are afraid of losing their jobs, they turn down the heat in their houses, turn down the air conditioning, stop heating their swimming pools. The question is, how do we pull off this same trick while doing the thing that Mr. Heintz talked about with the low carbon? How do we achieve low carbon prosperity is basically the question. It's easy to look busy on the environment, easy to look busy on climate, and much harder to have actual effects. And so now for the actual solutions to all our climate and energy problems, why don't, Frank, would you be willing to start? Is that an unfair?
No, that's fine. That's
okay.
Fine. I welcome the opportunity to start, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've not been back to the Milano School, this is for the dean, in probably 30 years. My wife went to the graduate school here, the School of Urban Affairs, and I used to wander these corridors many weekends. They weren't quite as nice as this 30 years ago. But I can attest it was a wonderful education. If there's anything today, if your student's receiving the type of education my wife received 30 years ago, then you're doing awfully well.
Welcome back.
Thank you. So when I received the invitation, I couldn't wait. I said to Wendy, I'm going to the new school. So it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I tell people that I have the best job in New York State government. I know the governor agrees with me. But one of the reasons why I'm able to do what I'm able to do is in part because of the governor's leadership. And I think as you tackle these issues, and Steve said a lot of this earlier, and there's very little that Steve said that I don't agree with. But I think if we're going to go about the challenge of dealing with the problem of climate change, there's a couple of different things that you need. And to a large degree, these are reflected in New York State as well as here in New York City. I said, I think the first thing you need, frankly, is political leadership. And we're very fortunate right now because the stars, so to speak, are kind of aligned. You have Washington with President Obama, certainly. He believes in the science of climate change and the need to take action. In Albany, and certainly the governor has his share of political problems, but there's been one issue that the governor has been consistent on, actually back to the days when he was the minority leader in the state senate through lieutenant governor and governor, and that's his commitment to the type of investments that need to be made to deal with the challenge of climate change. And certainly here in New York City, as Steve already alluded to, everybody recognizes the leadership of the mayor. So you bring all those things together, I think that's essential. The human element of this challenge cannot be overlooked. I think the second thing you need to go about this challenge is policies, governmental policies, that to one degree regulate, but on another hand, enable the type of investments and decisions that need to be made in order to deal with the challenge of climate change. And then the third thing you need is investment, and that's where this role of partnership comes in, again, that Steve alluded to. Virtually everything we do at NYSERDA nowadays, and I think we do an awful lot of things very well, is based upon this fundamental concept of partnership. You need government. You need government to help enable. Sometimes you need government to get out of the way. You need academia, because academia is the intellectual capital that we need to develop the ideas that are going to get us from the world we live in today to the world we live in 20 years from now. But ultimately, you need the private sector, because you need their capital invested in these wonderful ideas that academia may come up with and the government may enable. And I'm actually very excited about the possibilities of that here in New York State. I think there's an awful lot going on below the surface that doesn't always get recognized. And as we go on, I think I'll talk a little bit about it later on. But I think those are all fundamental aspects of a successful strategy to deal with the challenge of climate change. And I think all of those are in place here in New York State as well as in New York City.
Great, thank you. Michaela.
Thanks again for having me. It's a great honor to be on this panel. I was quite wowed over when I saw the list. So again, it's a great honor. But you know, it's wonderful to kind of bring this perspective of a neighborhood like the South Bronx to the panel, largely because I really think, you know, when we talk about the climate crisis, you know, the crisis has been happening in places like the South Bronx for decades, for people's lifetimes. And for us, you know, climate change is just another label to describe what we know firsthand, be it the health, the economic disparities, or the other whole host of issues that affect the well-being of residents and families from having opportunity. So when I think about the climate crisis and I think about the work we've been doing in the South Bronx and the partners that we work with, you know, it really is about the survival aspect. And great opportunities come out of that, those places, largely because you have to be creative. And I think, you know, I'd like to really encourage the panel in our conversation this evening to really to remember that, be conscious of the fact that, you know, while right now it's great that the larger public is thinking about the climate crisis and now it's, you know, part of the vernacular, you know, the issues of crises affecting local communities have long been an issue that wasn't marketable, wasn't getting the business sector. And so today represents an opportunity to really do the things that were mentioned in terms of partnerships, in terms of the types of policies that are necessary to really change the patterns of poverty that have too long affected our communities. And I just want to clarify, the organization Sustainable South Bronx, we really are trying to address environmental justice solutions. So you know, we're addressing the issues that affect the disparities that really negatively impact communities that have been overburdened by many of the facilities that have contributed to climate change. But we're really trying to look at solutions because we believe in that space, in the partnerships that we can get with businesses, that we can get with working with policymakers, real transformation can occur. So I just want to leave that aspect to remember, you know, the label climate crisis, we've been in crises for a long time. And again, it's not just the South Bronx, it's communities like the South Bronx we're the poster child too often, but there are places throughout this world that have long been neglected and hurt and burdened. So, you know, we need to really be honest with ourselves because these are the very communities that are going to be hit the hardest when these disasters start to hit, and they're already hitting. So I wanted to just start with that.
Oh, thank you. David.
Yeah. I want to thank the New School for having me, though I think tonight I'm the designated unpopular conservative panelist. And I just ask this one favor. I know you may not be able to hold back on the sighing and the harumphing, but if you give me 3 minutes before you throw the water bottles, I have a few things I do like to say. First, let me start off. Cities do a lot of wonderful things, and they could do a lot more wonderful things to make cities places to live, to attract people. Some of them will have a side benefit of perhaps offsetting some CO2 emissions or at least warming or cooling the cities. Planting trees along the streets, that's a great idea even if the world isn't going to get any warmer, all right? It's nicer to walk in the shade in the summer, even 20 years ago when it was cooler than it is now. Higher density development perhaps, making a more walkable city. That makes the city nicer to live in, makes it more attractive for people to come in. As we've heard, cities have a lower carbon footprint. That would, in my opinion, be a side benefit, not the main one. But we shouldn't make policies in cities that make them less livable because they're more expensive, less attractive because it's harder to get around. You're not allowed to use your car. Not we've made it more attractive to walk, but we've made it harder to use your car. May have the unintended consequence of forcing people further out into the suburbs, keeping them from coming to the city. They have a lot of things worse to worry about than climate change. And I just have to respond to some of the things that Stephen said. It is not scientifically proven we're headed to catastrophe. Phil Jones, the former head of the CRU, the Climate Research Unit in East Anglia, was interviewed in the past couple of months. He said, no, somebody asked me, is it a science failure? He said, absolutely not. He said, temperatures haven't warmed for the past 15 years worldwide. Now, most of the deniers, like me, were only going to give him 10, but he wanted to go back 15, fine. Well, he can choose that. Sea level rise is not accelerating, all right? It's still rising, but at a slower rate. Maybe it'll pick back up, who knows? Has the world been warming in the past 30 years? Most of the stuff I look at says yes. Is some of it due to man-made greenhouse gases? Almost certainly yes. I mean, the carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Does that mean we're headed to catastrophe? No, it does not mean that. Only the most extreme cases in the IPCC projections show anything close to catastrophe. All right. If we have 1/3 of the people in the city living in slums in the developing world, we want to do what we can to get them out of those slums. All right? And I don't think you're going to do that by a promise of a 2-degree cooler world 100 years from now. In any event, I think I see people reaching for the bottle, so I'm going to give up at this point.
I want to disappoint David by agreeing with much of what he said, and I think
throw them at him then if you.
I think that there is a danger in cities to become enthusiastic about the environment of overlooking the ways in which they are environmental leaders rather than environmental villains. New York City residents, for example, use less electricity per capita than any other residents than any other Americans. New York City is larger in population than all but 11 states. If it were granted statehood by itself, it would have the lowest per capita energy use in over all categories. And I think for those reasons, one of the things that David talked about, the critical environmental issues in a dense city tend to be things like education, crime, street smells, noise, outdoor lighting, not because of the energy implications, but because those are the things that drive people from cities into the vastly less benign living structures that we have in the United States. So I apologize for agreeing with you, but I do.
Accepted.
And Gregor, for a period of time, it was easy to be an environmentalist. It was easy to be an environmental purist because the chance of anything actually happening was close to zero. As the interest worldwide has increased in accomplishing things, we run into the difficulties. And I think there are any number of examples. The one that I often think about is the proposal, now a decade old, to place wind turbines in Nantucket Sound, one of the ideal places, or one of the few places in the United States with actual ideal conditions for generating electricity with wind. It's been resisted initially and held up by environmentalists, and there are now, when we reach the points where it's environmentalists versus environmentalists, and all the issues that were easy to think about when they were purely abstract become trickier once you actually have to do what Gregor is doing, which is trying to implement them. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that experience.
I don't have any direct
or some other experience.
On the Nantucket wind turbine controversy.
That wasn't what I was really asking you about.
I'll take it to the other coast and to the West Coast and the situation in Vancouver where, well, let me start by thanking the new school and Con Edison for making this all possible, bringing us all together. And it's a real privilege to be in New York City. It's a beautiful place this time of year. It really is. Any time of year. I qualified that a bit. But. So in Vancouver, we have a host of challenges, much as every city around the world does. And in terms of the capacity for political leadership, a lot of it will hinge on whether the garbage is being picked up, whether people can breathe the air, whether it's too noisy or too much traffic, whether you can deal with the basic infrastructure and quality of life issues. And so there are a lot of cities still struggling with that, and crime at the worst, living in fear, I think can override everything. I had a pretty challenging lesson. I ran on a campaign to make Vancouver the greenest city in the world by 2020. And I used the framing of greenest rather than just focus purely on climate, purely on CO2, or purely a technical kind of approach, because green encompasses air quality, water quality, food security, livability much more broadly, but it all ties into managing our carbon and being more efficient, being more productive, all good things for the economy, all good things for a community. But not trying to shrink it into a focus on carbon, which is a really abstract notion, I think, for all of us to try and wrestle with. So we're focused on this. I got elected on a lot of the momentum around this. There's a huge, I think, gut level feeling that we have to go here as a species, but certainly within our cities. And many cities like New York and Vancouver are great examples of where density and livable urban environment have created the most efficient, the lowest impact communities that there are in at least the Western world. We've had real breakthroughs on this level. That said, a few months into office, people started shooting at each other in the streets. Gangs had a showdown, and right away, all of the focus has to go to dealing with that level of fear, that level of we have to keep the city safer for the people who live here. So there are still cards that certainly trump environment, and even when you broaden environment into livability, there are real challenges for mayors across the world. Even though we can be very entrepreneurial, we can be like the small businesses of government at the scale that we operate on, but we're still accountable and responsible for making sure the city works, people feel good and comfortable. And sometimes that gets in the way of a green agenda. That gets in the way of really driving the pace, because I feel, as Stephen said, the need is critical right now. The timing is as urgent as it can possibly be, and our species may be a threat of extinction right now. So we got to focus on that. That said, there's a real striking a balance there between the day-to-day and the realities of living in a city, and trying to get ahead of the curve for the years to come is a real challenge for everyone in political office.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Stephen, do you have any reactions to your own talk?
Well, I find myself agreeing with myself most of the time on this. And I don't disagree with David on everything that he said either. And I don't think he disagreed with me on everything that I said. I certainly agree that cities need to be, as the mayor has said, working on the whole host of issues that make cities the great places that they are, and trying to improve the quality of life and the economy and opportunity for all of their citizens. And it's a hugely challenging job, and God knows, trying to run this city is probably the most challenging job one can imagine. But I do think the place where we disagree is on whether or not we face a possible catastrophe, and I don't think we need a protracted debate about that tonight. But I just think that even if we were to, and I wouldn't do this, but even if we were to say there's only a 5% chance of the kinds of outcomes I've described, wouldn't you want to take an insurance policy against those kinds of outcomes?
Well,
we do that in our homes. How many people have a fire in their house? In your entire lifetime, how many of you have actually had a fire in your house? How many of you bought fire insurance? So if we think
everyone but the person who had the fire, according to
No, but I'm serious. Even if we think the probabilities are very small, and the debate is actually pretty robust, and I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest the probabilities are a lot higher, even if we think it's pretty small, wouldn't we want to take some insurance out against this?
A question on that issue, which is one that I wrestled with myself in terms of trying to achieve some sort of agreement on the issues it faces. And I have often wondered if it would be better to talk about our climate challenge just simply in terms of energy. That our climate problem is really an energy problem, and energy is a less loaded issue to discuss. And whatever the percentage chance is that we face climate disaster, there's a 100% chance that we face an energy catastrophe at some point, because our prosperity has been based on basically taking things out of the ground and setting them on fire, and there's a point at which those things no longer exist. We assume the standard economic argument is that markets will simply provide a solution, but if you talk to people who actually work with these things, they're not nearly as as optimistic as economic theorists are. And I was talking to somebody who said that he was talking to a scientist, I think at Caltech, who'd been working with fusion, nuclear fusion, and his position was that he was hoping that the guys who were working with solar would have the answer. And a guy who was working with solar said that he was putting all his money on fusion. I was talking to someone else who said that we've been dealing with wrestling with the energy problem for a couple of thousand years, and we've really turned over most of the big rocks. And the issue that nobody ever really comes around to is that we're very good at solutions that involve buying something else, buying a different product, buying a new car. The commercials for the Prius passes through the gray landscape. I know you've seen this. The Prius drives through a gray landscape, and as it passes, everything turns green. And you get the feeling that you're actively doing something to improve the earth by driving your car through this landscape, as though you're sort of vacuuming evil things out of it. And that's not actually the way it works. How do we talk about not only the sort of hypothetical sacrifices that we tend to talk about, but the actual ones? How do we really pull off the low carbon prosperity, which is low energy prosperity? It's not the swap to any form of renewable energy it's not a one-to-one swap. It's a difficult, expensive thing. We have not invented a method of storing energy that comes anywhere close to crude oil. It's nothing remote. Is there anybody want to discuss this, David?
Yeah. This notion that we're going to run out of petroleum eventually, therefore we might as well give up on it now, is one we heard in the 70s. So, I'm talking about, we need to get rid of the old logic and go to the new. Well, the old logic was we're going to run out of everything right away. We're going to have catastrophe by the end of the century. And the only thing that's changed is the cause in the century. We're still going to run out of stuff by the end of the century. They keep finding more oil. The price goes up. People move to other things. I fully expect most of us will be driving hybrid cars, if not plug-in hybrids, within 25 years, but not within 5 or 10 years. It will be expensive. Markets do work, but they don't work perfectly. We see run-ups in prices and spikes. We see them all the time. That doesn't mean because markets haven't perfectly foreseen something that something else must be better.
Stephen, or anyone? Yes, Frank.
I was going to make the same point that Steve made and then segue into answering your question. I can remember 25 years ago holding a conference here in New York City, Governor Cuomo, Governor Coonan of Vermont, and Governor Kane of New Jersey, down at the old Vista Hotel at the World Trade Center, which is long since passed. And it was actually the same discussion we just had right now. And what it boiled down to was whether you agreed with the science or you didn't agree with the science, the general sense of the folks there was, doesn't it make sense to buy an insurance policy? Doesn't investing in a number of these technologies make sense, whether you believe that climate change is going to produce a disaster or not? It seems to me the prudent thing is to assume the worst and protect yourself against that, particularly if you can demonstrate that there are other compelling reasons to make the type of investments we're talking about here. Energy efficiency. Energy efficiency, to me, is common sense. The less energy you use, the lower your bills are. I can prove that. We've done sophisticated energy models. Now, your rate may go up, but your bill will go down if you lose less energy. It makes industry more competitive, and Lord knows in this neck of the woods, this region where energy costs are so expensive, we need to find everywhere we can to reduce the cost of energy and the amount of energy we consume. If you don't believe in that, listen to Secretary Chu. Secretary Chu says that we're engaged in a new industrial revolution. Whether we believe in these technologies or not, the Chinese do, Absolutely. The Indians do, the Russians do. They're investing billions of dollars in new technology because they're making the same bet that I'm just saying we need to make here, not only in New York State, but in the United States. And we've done a pretty good job in New York. We have a fairly aggressive renewable portfolio standard. We have brought in I think it's $4 billion worth of investment into New York State and large and small-scale renewable energy projects, which when you combine with the investment in energy efficiency, in fact, is reducing people's bills. But if you don't believe in the technology, what about the jobs? What about the kids here in New York City who are looking for the opportunity to get to work? And we're talking about, people who live in the neighborhoods that folks like McKellar represent, people who are looking for the dignity of a job that's represented by the opportunity to weatherize a home. But we're also talking all the way at the other end of the scale in upstate New York and Clarkson University, where they've reestablished a nuclear power engineering program because, frankly, we need nuclear power as well if we truly believe in the challenge of climate change. But if you don't believe in any of that, and again, I don't disagree that we're not about to run out of oil, think about the national security reasons. Even if we can continue to produce and discover more and more oil here in the United States, the reality is the market is determined by a global marketplace, and most of those reserves are controlled by people who, frankly, you wouldn't want to invest your children's future with. So I think there are a lot of other compelling reasons to go out there and to buy this insurance policy that we're talking about here, even if you don't believe entirely in the science of climate change, or even if you believe in the science but you don't believe it's going to be quite as dark or as dreadful as some might suggest.
I just want to add,
McKellar, yes.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I mean, along with that list of very important things to consider is the external costs. I mean, we've had embedded costs to a lot of the sort of resource extrapolation we've been doing for so many lifetimes of ours, and we don't truly account for that. And when we look at local places that have had negative health impacts from the very industries that run our economy, and those health impacts and the costs that gives to our government, to the other sort of economic crises that we're facing, I mean, there's all these other unintended consequences that we have let go on for far too long. So that's another reason why we should look more holistically at our system and invest in the sorts of technologies and the businesses that really can transform our economy to a clean one, to a green one. But I also want to point out that, that the aspect of new business generation, and one thing that I've been really extremely excited about throughout the programs we've been doing is the fact that we're training folks for the very jobs that were just mentioned. And we've been training people to be part of this green collar economy, folks who have faced numerous barriers to employment. For example, one of our graduates is now working for one of the largest weatherization companies in New York City, and he was formerly incarcerated, faced numerous barriers to employment, but now he has a living wage job and a career path. We have numerous stories of things, individuals who've faced those things and now part of this green economy, and now being able to talk to their folks in their communities and neighborhoods about how they can transform themselves as well. So, the external costs and health impacts are something that people are slowly making those connections, and that's the thing that I've noticed on the ground, and many folks across New York City have made those connections. The challenge is, how do we make sure our policymakers are making those connections and the folks in government? Because I found still a lot of challenges to getting certain city agencies to invest in certain neighborhoods in a way that actually does all those connection making.
Mayor.
Yeah, well, there's certainly barriers for a lot of cities in terms of investing and revitalizing and retrofitting neighborhoods, and that's where the collaboration with the private sector, with the nonprofit sector, with philanthropy, I think there's going to be a lot of new models. There are new models emerging to finance these kind of basically efficiency investments that will allow for more social equity, that'll ensure that that we do have a whole new wave of green jobs. We're certainly focused on that in Vancouver, and it's a very competitive landscape. If you look across the world at all the big cities, I don't think there's any mayor that isn't talking about green jobs and trying to get a piece of the action right now. It's very competitive. I'm going to be visiting companies here in New York who are interested in having a West Coast office, who are looking at financing tools and opportunities.
We need to take names.
So anyone here who's interested in doing business on the West Coast, talk to me after. But there are. The great thing is there are huge opportunities right now, and it's a competitive environment that I think we can succeed in at the same time that we lift all boats. That the tide can really bring and address a lot of the issues for low-income neighborhoods around energy equity. There's a lot of opportunities here to bring a more collaborative model together across society that integrates public policy, entrepreneurial opportunity, and real social equity.
Yeah, and social equity is a global issue as well. There are parts of the world where we whatever we feel about climate or energy, we wish that people would be burning more fossil fuels, because what they are doing instead, deforesting huge areas or making what we consider to be very poor environmental decisions, would be improved by. So it's not, we can't simply raise the, for example, turn the market into a machine to force all these changes without thinking of the equity issues around the world. I don't know, is there a solution to that problem on the board?
Well, you know, there's countless examples of different organizations that are working within local communities in third world countries where they're finding ways to do these very small projects to be fully off the grid. You know, very small solar projects to, you know, heating entire villages, lighting, you know, giving electricity, and they're completely off grid. So I think there's plenty of examples that we can look to actually outside of our country and use those locally. And I think what's, again, the big challenge is how do we, when we start to look at actually implementing those types of projects, we find a lot of the policy barriers to making that happen. For example, I know of a lot of projects in the Bronx that wanted to put solar in the buildings but had troubles with the connectivity issues. I know a lot of folks who would like to get into new programs to offset the cost, but again, they don't know how to figure out the paperwork. So there's a lot of, people, especially graduates of the Milano School, as you go out into these agencies, your work is ahead of you, because, that's the challenge. Those barriers to people feeling comfortable and going through that whole, unknown, uncertain territory, that's sometimes the biggest impediment to change.
Yeah,
Yes, David.
I think the argument for development in the developing world goes completely against this. And I almost get the feeling that people want to develop the ideal world for subsistence farmers. We want them to run off of a solar panel, not off the big generator like we have. They shouldn't aspire to our living standard. I will tell you that I've looked at every single major bill proposed in Washington in the past 2 years to address climate change. Every single one of them has very serious and significant trade restrictions that we're going to impose on developing countries because we're afraid they're going to take our jobs. Also the intent when you go to like Copenhagen is that we're going to come up with hundreds of billions of dollars we're going to transfer to compensate them for these, in essence, carbon taxes that we're going to force them to impose. I guarantee you those hundreds of billions will not come out of Washington. The trade restrictions will. You need to be very careful. This is not a city issue. This is a national issue. Pushing climate legislation if your goal is to help the developing world. I see it working the opposite, unfortunately.
Stephen.
Well, in fact, I think the problem that you're talking about is a very real one, and I think the major reason why the world leaders were unable to come up with any kind of significant binding agreement at COP15 in Copenhagen was precisely the challenge of meeting the needs of the developing world. And until the developed world has a really serious approach to global equity on this issue, we will not get to a major global compact. So we have to find the solution, and I don't think it has to be about trapping the developing world in some kind of arrested development lifestyle. It's about all of us changing the way the future of our lifestyles evolve in a way that is genuinely sustainable for the long term. And that's a big part of it. It's going to take transfers of technology, transfers of wealth, transfers of capacity, and global cooperation. And yes, those three things are going to be really tough to accomplish. But until we get together to do that, we will not have, a global compact to replace the Kyoto Protocol. So I think that's the key issue on the global level.
Any thoughts on how we actually do that? I'll quote somebody that I'm writing about at the moment who has worked heavily in these issues. And his suggestion is that we think of the distance between, if you think in terms of carbon, in terms of global if you think of global CO2 levels, where they are now, and what might be, we might think of as a ceiling. It's 390 parts per million now. And if you think of this, Bill McKibben's projected ceiling is actually a floor. It's 350 parts per million. Another number that people talk about is 450 parts per million. He pointed out that if we build LEED, platinum, zero energy dwellings for the 2 billion people that we're expecting to add to the world between now and mid-century, we'll basically, in the materials for and construction of those dwellings alone, we will use essentially all of our remaining carbon budget between now and 450. It's easy to talk about all these things. How do we accomplish them without really simply exacerbating the problem that we say that we're addressing? How do we do it by having more of what we've gotten used to having? And
Well,
this is a trick question.
I'll just point to one project we've been trying to get off the ground that, maybe will spark the panel to have a further conversation. The South Bronx, we are home to the second largest food distribution center in the world. So that means we get a lot of truck traffic. So we essentially see 60,000 trucks a week, about 15,000 a day. So one of the big issues, all this trucking occurs, it's mostly diesel. How do we deal with this? These businesses are in the focus of being businesses. They're busy delivering goods. So we've actually did a lot of truck research and surveying of the types of trucks that are in their fleets. And we've talked to local businesses that are in the process of maybe retrofitting them and trying to figure out, weigh that against the technologies, because the technologies are quite broad and, as you may imagine, very expensive. But there's actually some really low-tech things that can happen on the ground. And then when we marry that to actual programs, it's very interesting because a lot of the programs really want the high-end stuff, but most of these trucking fleets, they just would never invest on that level. Mm-hmm. So that's something that we're trying to do. I think those are the smaller niche things that if you aggregate them, you could actually do some really powerful things.
And it's a good point, and it makes a critical distinction, I think, which is that a walking neighborhood, which there are many of in New York, is a very truck-dependent neighborhood because things have come to people. And so the answer is not to eliminate trucks, but you're really dealing with a local environmental issue, which is a quality of life issue involving how you bring the materials to those places. One thing I gave a talk in Portland where someone pointed out that what makes a neighborhood walkable, and the suggestion was that what makes a neighborhood walkable is having I'm sorry, you could let you look at my front for a minute. What makes a neighborhood walkable is having walking access to a grocery store, and I think you could probably use that as a measure. It's not greenways, where people often, when environmentalists will talk about making our cities more walkable, they will talk about let's build green places where people can walk. But what you really want is a grocery store that you can get to from where you live. It doesn't feel green, but that's I think that's probably a better measure of green than some of the other things that we tend to talk about.
David,
yes.
In response to what Bill wrote, if you took what he wrote to its logical conclusion, we'll just kind of all throw our hands up in the air and go home and pull the covers over our head. But I just think that's kind of a false...
Bill McKibben, are we talking about?
Yes.
Yes.
I think that's kind of a false way of looking at it. There is an awful lot that can be done to reduce the amount of energy one uses without going to the extreme, so to speak, of some of the things that need to be done to get you a platinum certified, LEED certified building. I'll give you two simple examples, and these are real world examples. We have a $2 billion brand new chip manufacturing facility being built in upstate New York, in Malta, just outside of Saratoga. It's a fairly sophisticated company. My people and our contractors walked into that building. They're building a brand new building. Without the investment of any significant new resources, we were able to show them how they could reduce their energy consumption in that building without changing their production by 35%. You'd figure a company like AEMD, a fairly sophisticated international firm, would know something like that. They don't. An even better example is GE is building a brand new battery manufacturing facility in Schenectady. That's remarkable. We're building a manufacturing facility in upstate New York. If anybody knows anything about energy, you'd think it's GE. The same group of people we sent in there from NYSERDA with our contractors, working with GE, again, without having to spend all the stuff on new materials, we're able to help them reduce their energy consumption by another 30%. So there's lots of things you can do. You're talking about a residential structure, a new housing development, just the way you face some of these homes. Kind of what is referred to as passive solar can have a significant impact upon the energy use in that facility without putting one new piece of equipment or sophisticated recycled materials. There are many very low-cost ways of reducing energy consumption without in any way disturbing your lifestyle. And part of the problem is getting that information out there. It's like Keller talks about in her community, just getting the information to the consumer so they know about the opportunities that are out there, not only to reduce energy, but to find jobs. We try, but we don't do as good a job as we can. And one of the exciting things I think that's happening in New York is the utility industry is getting back into the energy efficiency business. When we deregulated the utility industry in New York 15 years ago, the state pulled them out of the energy efficiency business, and that's when my agency took off. We went into the energy efficiency business, and we're really good at what we do. But we cannot reach the individual consumer the way the utilities can. And one of the real assets of the Con Eds of the world getting back into the energy efficiency business is they can reach the individual consumers with this sort of information in a way that a state agency cannot. And it's valuable information.
I have another trick question, which is how do we prevent ourselves from simply reinvesting our that energy efficiency into more energy consumption? The history of our civilization has been of ever increasing energy efficiency. People like to say that the modern cars don't get that much better mileage than a Model T Ford did, but in fact, driving is vastly more efficient today. I never have to leave my car. I can eat in it. I can, my children can watch television. I mean, they're in their 20s now, but young children now. I drove behind a car recently, and I could see that the two children in the back seat were watching separate movies on the on screens above them. We can make our cars more efficient, but do we drive down the environmental problems caused by driving simply by making driving less expensive to the people who do it? Not every form of resource consumption behaves that way. In New York City in the 1970s, when the new efficient plumbing fixtures were introduced, water use in New York City went down and stayed down ever since. It went down by a significant percentage. But New York City is unusual. People don't go to the bathroom. They weren't paying for water then, so they didn't realize any cost savings. People don't go to the bathroom more just because they can do it with less water. And New Yorkers don't have lawns to water. So there was no place for that efficiency to be reinvested. The rest of us, when our electric bill goes down, when we install a more efficient air conditioner, we tend to leave the air conditioner on, and this has been the experience over and over. We didn't just invent efficiency. In other words, we've been working on efficiency for centuries.
But even there, I would argue, there's fascinating things that can be done that could affect human behavior. Some of the things that are happening now in terms of technology development with regard to smart grid can send the type of information to a consumer that they don't get nowadays that would in fact maybe not reduce their overall, well, I think it would reduce their overall consumption, particularly in those periods of the day where the demand hits a peak and the price theoretically is high enough. One of the challenges we have, and this is where I think the Heritage Foundation makes some good points, is we haven't got the economic signals right yet for the consumer. And in New York State, we actually have a statute that prohibits time-of-day pricing for residential customers, which makes it even more challenging to get the right information. But there are ways that you can, through existing technology, not even talking about some of the newer technology that's coming, that can directly affect consumers' decision on the use of energy.
But it's always coupled. There's an economic incentive always there too. I know my own personal energy use went down dramatically in 2008, and it went right back up again, along with everybody else's when it went down significantly when I paid almost $5 a gallon for home heating oil, and it went. I lost interest in turning down the thermostat as soon as it went back down again. Good old economics 101. But it's the same question I had before: is how do we manage that without impoverishing ourselves or without causing ourselves to undermine our efforts to create this prosperity? How do we do it without limiting our ability to do the kinds of acquisition that keep things flowing in the economy?
I'll give an interesting example of how dramatic behavioral change can be to a real game-changing situation. Literally, it was during the Olympic Games, so game changer in more ways than one. We had basically a transportation crisis in the making going into the games. We have a very dense downtown, similar to Manhattan, and we don't have the capacity to add hundreds of thousands more people to our transit system and our road network. But that was what was going to happen. So we embarked on this aggressive communications campaign, basically telling everyone to stay home for a couple weeks, or choose another way to travel downtown, on foot, on bike, on transit. We invested a very modest amount of dollars, about $17 million, to bump up the transit system a little bit, more cars on the trains and more buses. But our goal was to get 30% of the cars off the road, so that the road network, some of the road network had to be dedicated to Olympic lanes to get the athletes around and make sure visitors could move around. But there was a hue and cry, and there was all these doom and gloom predictions that this would be a disaster, as it was in Atlanta, as it has been in many Olympic cities. Anywhere there's a mega event like that, you just can't. You don't have the capacity in the transportation system. We worked with a lot of businesses to say, how can you plan? How can you shift your ways of doing business? How can you get more staff telecommuting? How can you create new models within your business for these few weeks? And there was quite a big uptake from the business community that became quite competitive, all in the spirit of the Olympics. And when time came, it was as if, I mean, we talk about the doom and gloom of climate crisis and the potential, and if you hearken back to times of war when people can, at basically the flip of a switch, dramatically change their behavior to conserve resources, to be more efficient. Well, it happened. We were over 30% right off the bat, cars off the road. We actually hit 44% fewer cars on the road during the middle of the games, which is unthinkable for anyone that's had anything to do with traffic and transportation. This is mind-boggling. London for 2012 is obviously very interested in our models and our technique. And communication was really the driver here. It was about, and the fact that we had a sort of pseudo-disaster scenario, so that everyone was paying attention, everyone was thinking about it, they heard about it over and over, and they made different plans. But it demonstrated that, with all the great, I think, advances we can make with efficiency, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Behavioral change is our trump card, and ultimately we're capable of dramatically minimizing our impact, especially if we have more technologies that enable that. But we can make those decisions if the education's better, if the communications are better, and the nonprofit sector has a real role to play here. Governments have a real role, and business has a role. We can make dramatic change very quickly, and particularly around energy use and transportation choices.
How do we, Greg? How do we make that kind of change permanent? It's one thing during the Olympics.
That's a good question.
And I think politically too. I mean, have we advocated plowing up those automobile lanes that were empty as a result? It's a big step. I don't know. I mean,
it is a big step, but it's created it's transformed the public discourse around. Well, we can't close these streets because it'll be bad for business. All of a sudden, well, it wasn't bad for business, and now it's reversed the pressure. How quickly can we close the streets, at least for weekends? There's been it's flipped it over. We haven't, obviously it's not still 33% reduction in car traffic. It went back to the way it was for the most part, but a lot of businesses have now changed their programs. They're allowing a lot more telecommuting. A lot of the companies that did that have maintained some of that. So we've ended up making a really significant incremental gain from that kind of shock therapy, and some pressure on me and my colleagues at City Hall to deliver on more options. And in some cases, it's take the parking off a street so the buses can roar up and down, and the transit is better service. And where you can never take parking away under normal circumstances. But
yeah, here in New York City, there's I think one of the great innovations that has taken place is the creation of these bicycle lanes that are where you basically move the curb and the curbside parking one lane out, and it creates a non-death zone bike lane for bicyclists, while retaining the basic street architecture, but also removing an entire lane of traffic. And New York City gets the benefit of what Jane Jacobs called attrition of cars, which is that the crises, the disasters that people often predict for the removal of road capacity often don't occur. Just the traffic melts away somehow. Yes,
I think that this conversation is reinforcing an essential point here, which is that it's the role of the three sectors. It's also the role of the different mechanisms that we have as tools in this fight. And some of them are market-based mechanisms, and we need to implement those market-based mechanisms to get appropriate pricing for some of these things that people count on, because that obviously does have a huge impact on behavior. Some will be regulatory. You know, the placing of the bike lanes and redesigning the way the city grids work and all of that is regulatory activity. We managed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act in the 1970s, which dramatically improved air and water quality through regulation. So some of this is going to be regulatory, some of it is going to be market-based institutions and mechanisms, and others will be about public education and public engagement and helping people to understand the implications of their choices. And there's a new field that's developing that I'm just learning about that's fascinating. It's not maybe a new field, but we're using an existing field to think about climate, which is the field of neuroeconomics, to understand how the brain works when people are making economic decisions. And how can we learn from that science about how to create the programs and the systems and the language, to get back to your point about maybe it's not a conversation about climate, it's a conversation about energy, or it's a conversation about the new economy. I happen to think it's a conversation about the new economy. But we're learning these things from neuroeconomics. And it's this combination of things that we're going to need to muster in a very robust way to really get us to the goals we need to achieve.
I think that's a perfect futuristic note to move to questions from the audience on. And the way we're going to do it is there's a microphone on either side of the room, and if you raise your hand, the people at the microphones will call on you, and then we'll come up here. And the members of the panel, if you have additional things to say, you can always slip them in as an answer to a question. It's just like on TV where TV doesn't move backwards. You can just answer the question that you wish you had been asked. But I'm sure they'll actually answer the questions that are asked. To keep your eyes out. Don't look at me. Look for a microphone. Yes. Yes, sir.
No.
No.
My comments are important, so. Now is it on?
There you go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really have a difficulty, Mr. Heintz, with the science is settled on this. I just read two books, one by Bjorn Lomborg, and the other, I believe it's called Climate Extremes, by two climatologists. And as far as they're concerned, and many, many other people, but science is far from settled. I agree with the gentleman from Heritage House. I'm in the business of financing small businesses all around the United States. So I mean small companies, 5, 10 employees. And I can, from a hands-on, I'm a businessman. I'm not a theoretician or an academician. I'm just a bag of donuts business guy. And their concerns are survival. And we try to do what President Obama encourages, is to get small businesses to hire people. The other thing I didn't hear one word about was agriculture. I mean, that's a huge, has huge impacts. Now, my personal, I meet once a month, period. That means a lot. If everybody did that, that'd be a huge. But I'm looking for more substantive solutions. I've heard a lot of kind of theories, but I just, could the panel give us something specific?
Actual answers, eh? All right. That's a job for the panel.
Well, first, let me address the science a little bit. Yeah, sure, we can all find things to read that will challenge the science. But the point is, if you look at the vast majority of peer-reviewed scientific articles that are appearing in the mainstream scientific journals going back for decades, you will find a very, very strong consensus that this is a phenomenon that is real and that it is significant and that it is dangerous. You will be able to find some who will write things that don't agree with that, and that's part of the intellectual freedom that we enjoy in our society. But I really hold to my view that if you look at the mass of scientific evidence, it supports the notion that the climate is warming and that this is very dangerous.
I think we tend to forget about old-fashioned pollution. It has sort of fallen off the radar. And we talked about markets and energy, and there is still a tremendous number of BTUs worth of fossil fuels in the in the earth. One of the difficulties, though, is where economics will push us is to some of the grodier of those fossil fuels. The world's problem isn't really oil, isn't running out of oil. It's not running out of coal. It's the increasing use of coal, which has, even if you don't think that anything about the atmosphere, there are tremendous environmental consequences to tearing the earth apart to burn coal, and then burning coal itself. The worst cold I've ever had came from spending just a week in Beijing, and I came home and felt that I was coughing up China for a month.
Yeah, but that's not the CO2 problem.
That's why I say energy may be less loaded way to talk about.
But I think you raise a different, more important point, and that is there are real pollution problems with soot and so on that we have addressed fairly effectively. Maybe the Con Ed people could speak to that as far as pulling stuff out of the coal emissions that China apparently, I've not been there, but I've seen pictures, hasn't even tried. And to divert them towards this
Well, they are trying.
Goal
that's,
of CO2.
That's not fair.
Okay, it's not fair. They're trying, but it's very expensive.
Well,
I don't think we should have them
the
devote resources towards a far down the road possibility of something bad when they have a horrendous problem right now that could use those resources.
And actually, the Chinese are increasingly aware of exactly that problem. I mean, they live in it themselves. You can't,
right?
As David experienced, you can't walk the streets of Beijing and not know you've got a problem with air quality, largely driven by coal and other particulates. So they have closed down in the last few years. I can't give you the numbers, but it's a significant number of really dirty coal-fired plants as they are bringing online more efficient coal-fired plants, but they're still burning the coal. But they know, too, that this is not their future. Now, to get to your question about very practical things, I think Frank has got, the kinds of solutions for your small business clients. There are lots of things that small business can do to improve their energy efficiency and reduce the cost of business simply by doing it. And that also has the added effect of improving their bottom line and contributing in a scale that is commensurate with their entities to the overall climate solution. And this is the kind of stuff that people can do. And NYSERDA has a fantastic program.
Well, we have some, but I was going to get specifically to your question as a small businessman. It's tough if you're a small businessman. You described it absolutely right. You're worried about surviving from day to day, and even if you wanted to do the good thing in terms of a public good, that's awfully difficult to do. Unless you're a small business in which energy is a major part of your cost of doing business, you're not going to spend much attention on that unless somebody's willing to give you the money to pay attention on that. And that's where we've had real problems with small businesses at both the governmental level as well as the utility level, is developing financial programs. The capital markets, as you know better than I, are very, very tight right now, and finding the resources that make it affordable for you as a small business to actually invest. It's great for me to sit here and tell you that, and I've had this conversation with people, if you make this investment in energy efficiency, it'll pay itself off in 7 years. Well, that isn't bad economics, but you'll be out of business in 7 years because of a variety of other things. So we have to find a way of bringing down the cost of some of these investments and finding lower cost capital that would make economic sense for you to make the investment in these sort of energy efficiency gizmos, as I call it, that could reduce your bottom line of doing business. But if you get in touch with me, I'll have somebody come visit you, see if we can.
Mira, we have a question over on...
We'll have Con Ed come pay a visit because we do want to help.
And I just want to add one other thing. There's a lot of different, different cities across the country that have created certain specific economic programs to help small businesses green up. For example, in the Bronx, under the former borough president's office, I helped with an initiative to create small business loans, zero-interest loans for businesses that want to make investments in their operations. So, for example, the fish market, a lot of the fish vendors were able to buy fully electric forklifts. Now, that wasn't something they would traditionally invest in because those forklifts are more expensive, but with the zero-interest loan program they did, and now, they're not adding to the other environmental problems. So I know, countless different cities, and if you're working with businesses across the country, I know the city of Portland has, the sustainability office. Again, there's lots of technical assistance that can help businesses improve on their bottom line. The challenge, of course, is finding that information. So, but it's out there.
Thanks, Michaela. Mira, yes.
Yeah, as somebody who grew up when children played ball and jump rope, now every child starts at 5 or 6 using an electronic device. I mean, so when you talk about the future of the planet and and use of energy, the things that kids are doing are now so oriented to electronic devices, and that doesn't bode well for using
it's a growing
energy
issue.
well.
On the one hand, they're inside, not out setting things on fire. On the other hand, there is one of the fastest growing use of energy in the world is all these things that we think of as efficiency increasers. It's the server farms and all the things that connect us together. It's a large and I've seen numbers that the energy and greenhouse footprint of internet use now exceeds that of air travel and is growing on a steeper curve than any other single use in the world. Those are some very soft, suspect statistics, but it points up one of the issues regarding efficiency, which is we tend to reinvest efficiency in further consumption, and which is certainly what as Google makes its servers more efficient, they add more of them, and we keep more and more stuff preserved online, and so anyway, I don't have the answer to that one either. Look for a microphone. Oh yes, yes.
Yes. I'm okay with the insurance idea. I'm okay with trying to reduce the impact carbon on energy. As an economist, I completely agree with we need to understand the cost better. And I think there are a lot of examples out there where you can save energy and be more prosperous. So I'm all for that. The gentleman asked another question over here, and I just want to come back to that, which is it all about energy, or what about agriculture? What about we hear that there are other kinds of greenhouse gases, and that maybe some of those have even methane, have even more impact. So I'd just like to hear, at least from our experts here, a little discussion beyond the narrow, what I think was a narrow discussion.
Great. Good question.
I can take a first stab at it. I was a small business and a farmer before that, so my background is in the food business, and there's an enormous carbon footprint from the agricultural sector. One that is in part driven by meat, to put it bluntly, and part driven by food miles. And but you can't. There are details to all of this that have to be explored. And I know you've written about local food and how it can actually add up to a bigger carbon footprint at times if it's not done right. But there are huge impacts. Methane is the big greenhouse gas contributor from the agricultural sector and the meat industry in particular. It's very difficult. I've grown everything from animals to vegetables and everything in between, and it is a very difficult thing to address behavioral change with people and what they eat and say, you know what, you got to eat less meat. It's kind of like talking about sex or politics or religion at the kitchen table. Challenging people on what they eat is one of the more difficult arenas we have. That said, there's enormous impact created by this, and I think again there's a real opportunity here if we can do it and use education to connect to the kids, to have more gardens in schools. There is a big movement greening schools and putting gardens and teaching kids this is where your food comes from. That kind of literacy is really important, and to understand that to connect the dots between what we eat and the impact that it has on the environment and the atmosphere. So I think there's a lot of good work being done here. It's but a lot of people are not that open to hearing criticism about their food choices right now, and that's there's work to do there.
You're so correct. It's a tremendously emotional issue, and it's just like stepping on a landmine if you begin to talk about it.
I don't think it's too surprising we didn't address that, given that this topic was about cities. I mean, it is big, but I think the forum wasn't specifically.
But city dwellers eat, and
yeah.
there's definitely a sort of an idea that what we need to do to cities is grow food in them in vacant lots, and there may be from a livability, the kind of thing we talk about. It may be that having gardens in a city is one of the things that makes people willing to live in this efficient dense arrangement. But from a food point of view, it's ridiculous. And I think that we all want to feel that we're doing something. And the example I like to use is my New Yorker colleague Susan Orlean, who now, like many people, is raising chickens at home and feeling very good about it from an environmental point of view. But she drives individual chickens to the veterinarian. The carbon footprint of the eggs that she serves herself is staggering. But nevertheless, there's what Greg says. I mean, the simplest thing that we could all do to reduce our carbon footprint would be to stop eating meat, and not to start eating the kind of potato chips and those kind of things, but to just the environmental impact, the energy impact, the water impact, another topic we haven't really talked about of eating meat. And I would exclude bacon from that. That will never be.
But just David, I was going to say the agricultural industry in New York State's a little different than a lot of other areas. And probably the largest single component of our agricultural industry in New York is the dairy industry. And the cows do produce a substantial amount of methane. And we have been working with the agricultural community trying to develop management techniques that allow you to deal with the waste byproduct. One of the more interesting technologies is the anaerobic digesters, but they cost money. And if the small businessman's having a hard time making ends meet, think of what the farmer's how difficult it is for them, particularly in upstate New York right now, where they're dependent upon the price of milk, which is not the best when it comes to, and you get into that upstate, downstate conflict, understandably. Consumers here want to keep milk products prices low, and upstate, the farmers are looking to keep the prices a little bit higher so they can make a living. So it's a challenge. But there are some technologies, like anaerobic digesters that offer some promise. But it's a very difficult area to move the farmers. There isn't a whole lot that can be done. There's the lifestyle choices that get involved in all of this. And it's an older and older generation running the fewer and fewer farms we have in New York State.
I just want to add, too, I mean, there's actually, New York City has got this incredible food movement that's been going on. Last year, I attended in Brooklyn, there was a food conference, and over 2,000 plus people packed in a school over the weekend. I mean, there was it was standing room only. I mean, everyone is really hungry for quality food. And, I just attended a Bronx Green Jobs Summit, and we're talking about food, and the borough president is hosting a food conference in May, and I know the borough president of Manhattan held one a few months ago. So New York City has a very savvy community when it comes to food and local food, and I think the next challenge is how do we connect to local farmers? I mean, already our farmers markets are really well attended. I mean, the one at Union Square is a perfect example. But again, how do we make those connectivities? How do we understand the neighborhoods that are interested in this sort of food access? I know in the Bronx, the biggest challenge is how do we get more farmers comfortable in coming to some of the neighborhoods? And how do we get the neighborhoods comfortable with the food? Because oftentimes they're just not familiar with this fresh food. So that educational aspect of it is really important. I know part of our work and partners that we work with is about how do we educate the neighborhood? How do we cook the food while it's being sold so that people understand how to cook vegetables if they've never seen it outside of a can? That's the other big picture is we don't know where our food comes from. And until we start to understand that, understand the extra resources associated with it, we won't change our patterns.
Yeah, well, I think many forms of our consumption, energy too, you've talked about education, and there's a tremendous disconnect, I think, between our people and actual knowledge about the energy we use. Mm-hmm. I had a caller on a radio program once who said that that there were cars were coming along that didn't require energy. This was a public radio station. Didn't require energy. There's something in the trunk. You put water into it, and it just goes. And so that was his understanding of fuel cells, which is not strictly factually accurate.
I'm pretty sure that was true because I saw it on YouTube.
Yes, Mira. Yes. Yes, ma'am.
All right. I was told you guys would like it if I told you I was a student, which I am. But I guess sometimes I get frustrated with the discourse, and I think I've heard it going around in the questions in the panel tonight, with the fact that we don't really talk a lot about less. I think we have a misguided perception, especially in this country, of what abundance should look like and exactly how much that translates to. And I'm wondering, David gave the example of the Prius, that somehow we have the idea that if we just purchase different things, doesn't matter if it's the same amount as we've been purchasing or using all along, that's going to change and everything's going to fix itself. So to the policymakers and the economists on the panel, I guess I'm wondering, are we not delivering or hearing this message because it's politically inappropriate and clandestine, or are we not hearing it because we really truly think that sustainable development and a green color economy, that our problems are not a matter of quantity and what we consume, but simply just switching it to something else?
That's the key question, and I think there's another element too, which is that how little we ourselves are interested in the answer to it.
Oh, I think that is the key question, and there have been some, startling studies about the consumption patterns of global population, and if we had as a goal of raising the living standards of everybody on the planet to the median living standard of people in the developing world, we would need something like 5 planets of natural resources to accomplish it if we make no adjustments in what we consume. So ultimately, your question is exactly the right question, and I think the reason that it's not debated more than it is, and it gets to this question about all these electronic things and the pressure that people feel socially to have more and to use more, is that politically it's a very, very difficult conversation for a mayor or a governor or a U.S. senator to really have with their constituents at this part, which is why other sectors and other institutions in society need to be the ones raising and pushing those questions and stimulating that discussion, because it is a discussion we have to have.
The average American house has doubled in size since the middle of the last century. And as it has doubled in size, we've filled all that extra space with stuff, and it's a huge problem. And in addition, another topic that we don't talk about is population. I think for a number of reasons. I think for conservatives, it's a difficult question because it raises issues of family and birth control and abortion. And for liberals, it's a tough question because it brings you square into issues of immigration. But we in America tend to think of the world's population problem as a China problem or an India problem. China and the United States are, according to some projections, will add about the same number of people to the planet over the next, by roughly mid-century, another 100 million people apiece. From an energy point of view, from a resource point of view, from a climate point of view, from a water point of view, the world has much more to fear from the Americans than from the Chinese, because we consume at a significant multiple of anybody else except Canadians and Australians and a few other people in the world.
Speaking of Canadians,
yeah.
It is a so one of the 10 goals that we have in Vancouver in our greenest city target is on consumption specifically, and it's been a really difficult one to develop, and it will be challenging to implement. But we have a term that actually came from the University of British Columbia, work that was done there by a professor named William Rees, is identified something called the ecological footprint, which is, I think, finding its way around the world as a concept. Vancouver's ecological footprint right now is a little over 4 planets worth, and our goal is to achieve a 1-planet footprint in the city of Vancouver. And that goal ends up interconnected with our food security goal, with waste, and going upstream in the waste to reduce packaging. It's through the energy and transportation systems. So it's a bit of a catch-all. And in fact, you could almost frame the entire piece, the entire green quest here around reducing consumption, because it touches everything else. And that does speak to this difficult. Politically, I can go so far on it, but I'm going to need a lot of support from the community, a lot of support from activists, from nonprofits, from businesses that offer products that use less and are more efficient and streamlined. So I think it's going to have to be a big group effort, but how we frame it and then move into implementing, whether it is regulating packaging industry, whether it's consumer campaigns to reduce consumption and make different choices. We've got to take it on, because at this point, Canada and the U.S. and Australia are totally out of control in terms of what we consume, and I don't think our lives are any better for it. I don't think the happiness factor is any higher. In fact, it's probably not.
And just to say a word for cities, the the places where prosperous Americans and Canadians have been successful at reducing their consumption is in cities, because the constraints on consumption are built in. It's not a behavior question. It's the size of your apartment question. And I think that's a useful thing to think about and to keep in mind, because there are ways of, New Yorkers have always consumed less than other Americans, no matter what was happening with the economy, no matter what was happening with the price of energy, no matter what people think about, no matter what they think about the climate, no matter what they think about the environment. They're constrained by the way they live. It's true in all dense cities.
Dave,
yes,
I was going to say, this is the case. Government cannot solve all problems, and I'm not sure this is one of those problems that government can solve, because to a large degree what the young lady is talking about is really a reflection of people's values. And I don't think you get taught that very much by government. I think you get taught that in the home, you get taught that in your church, you get taught that in your community. When I talk about energy, I can recall back when I first went into the public sector in the late 70s, the image of President Jimmy Carter, who I think is one of the most thoughtful, sincere public officials we've ever had, sitting there in front of a TV talking about the energy crisis and wearing a sweater. And that message went nowhere. That was and that's basically telling people you need to sacrifice, you need to use less. That hurt the efforts, I always believe, that hurt the efforts to promote energy efficiency far worse than some of the political opponents of energy efficiency. So I've long ago stopped talking about using less. I've talked more about whatever you do use it more efficiently. I do believe longer term, if you use what energy you use more efficiently, you're ultimately going to end up using less of it. So there's a lesson to be taught. Now, the one encouraging thing in all of this is, and I have children as well, I find the children, and I'm talking about young men and women from the early 20s downward, have a much better sensitivity to some of these issues like climate change than we ever had. And they're able to connect the dots a little bit better than we were in terms of some of these global or local challenges and the way their behavior relates to the problems that get created. So to me, to some degree, the best hope we have still is the generation yet to come, which hopefully will do a whole lot better than we did.
I don't think that the government gets a pass on this, though, and I see it in the little extraordinarily inefficient, high carbon footprint town where I live in Connecticut. I'm the chairman of the zoning commission, and the rules that we make for how we build our communities are basically guarantee that we will have bad energy and efficiency and climate outcomes. And if the World Trade Center had been built according to the zoning regulations that were in effect in my town at that time, there would have had to be 8 towers, 6 of them devoted to parking, because like many municipalities in the United States, we require 1 parking space for every 100 square feet of office space. I think it's one of where the advantages that we have in a city is to break that. In cities, is to break that lock. But even in cities, it's hard to really. I think even urban dwellers have a hard time coming to terms with that. And I was speaking with a group in Seattle where there was an attempt to sort of densify downtown to make it possible for people to live without cars in downtown Seattle, and it was a proposal to build a walking-oriented apartment building in downtown Seattle, and the project was killed by sort of hippie-era environmentalists who viewed any sort of development, urban development, as a bad thing because it's not back to the land. And the tool that they used to defeat it was the city's parking regulations. They said there were not enough parking spaces in this building that people are going to be parking on the streets. So there are all these things. I think that government stands in the way in a variety of different ways, often when the intention is the opposite of what the effect is.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to, I think the reason we don't see politicians running on the let's consume less platform is because people don't want to consume less. And usually people that want less consumption want it for somebody else to be less. The good news is, for instance, this BlackBerry. If you're talking about consuming less and not having a lower standard of living, it has more memory, more computing power, more colors than my computer did back in 1981. Had a lot less mass, a lot less draw on the world's resources, and it doubles as a phone. So, which if you look at the phone I was using in 1981. So we can consume more without consuming more pounds. We've been doing that. Well, we've offset it. We're actually consuming more pounds, but we're consuming tremendously more value. And so we can do that. Whether we will anytime soon, I don't know.
That's the question. Yes, Mikhail.
I just wanted to add, I mean, there's also a way of designing our world differently, using the sort of mindset of cradle-to-cradle thinking, we're not going to stop everyone from consuming. And I struggle with this a lot because my family's still back in Oregon, and every time it's like I hear what they filled their house with next, and it's so different than my small apartment in New York City. And I struggle with that because, I'm trying to tell them the negative impact of doing X, Y, and Z, but yet that's their life. So my family's my litmus test on my reality check, really. But, thinking about cradle to cradle, and how do we design our systems, our economies, our businesses differently? And then what are the policies associated with that to encourage businesses and the end use of products so that is possible? I think that is a real role for policymakers to work alongside with businesses and the financial community to make that feasible, because I know that doing that differently is really scary to a lot of different people. But I think it goes back also to the messaging. One of the big things that I found, we have a youth program with high school students right now to think about science, technology, engineering, and design. And what's incredible to me is they're on their iPhones or other pieces of technology, and it's true, the comment earlier, I mean, yes, youth are very attuned to that versus the broader world around them. We took them to some of the waste handling facilities in the neighborhood in Hunts Point. And what was incredible for me, of course, is to see that their eyes light up and get the connection of the end use of those gadgets and the fact that they're in their neighborhoods. And I think just like we talked about food, and if folks understood that their tomato actually comes from a plant and the whole process that it went through, if people also understand where these things end up and how they can negatively impact their neighborhoods, or what those other extra costs are, I think that is another aspect of how we consume differently. No one wants to see, some massive truck rumbling through with spewing metal and all these other things. No one would want that in their neighborhood, but we have to make people feel it differently. And right now it's so far detached from our daily lives that no one's going to consume differently. So how do we message that? How do we connect people to that? I mean, that's the bigger challenge, I think.
Great. Gregor, you want the last word?
The last word. Well, I think that the evening was well framed, and by Stephen's comments around urgency and the consequences of not being more proactive, and in fact some more urgency to our actions. And there is, I remain ever hopeful, and because I see in our city all this capacity and all this desire to be more efficient, to consume less, to embrace the political change, and we've been able to start implementing really aggressively on the ground. And we're a city that in 1990 we have had a commitment going back decades to greening our city. In 20 years, basically, we're going to achieve our Kyoto targets at the same time that we've grown our population 27% and our economy 18%. So this whole notion that all graphs are going up at the same time is a hoax, basically. We can grow our economy, we can move population around without increasing our impact on the environment, and specifically with carbon. So there are lots of stories emerging from cities that are of success. At the same time, I think the crux of my problem in Vancouver, and I think it's faced by many other cities, is we can tackle these pieces at a local level, and the scale is graspable. We can change the policy, we can have meetings, town hall meetings, and we can communicate fairly directly. When the policy decisions move up to state, provincial, or federal level, or heaven forbid, UN, WTO level, there's no accountability, there is no urgency, and as we saw in Copenhagen, as we've seen with trade issues globally, it's so abstract and far away from the people, from the neighborhood, from the choices that we make day to day in our lives. It's very hard to make the change that we want to see. So it harkens back to probably some of what really fueled this school in decades past, that grassroots and that people coming together to make the change how it was going to happen. but we are faced with this kind of a wet blanket at senior levels of government that is really, I think, in a lot of ways holding back this burning desire on the ground to make the change that we feel in our guts and that, frankly, makes good business sense and is practical. So if there's ways that we can dissolve that wet blanket, I think, and I'm not going to venture guesses into doing that, but a lot of it, I think, is just locally taking action and empowering ourselves and basically claiming jurisdiction for these choices and not worrying about the consequences. It's not like the Army's going to roll in and shut us down if we make these decisions locally. So I think there's a lot to just feeling more empowered at a local level and as a community, and acting on that, most importantly.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you to the entire panel. Stephen, Gregor, David, Michaela, and Frank. Thanks.
Let me just join David in thanking the panelists. And clearly there's a lot to chew on. I'm grateful to you for ending us on a hopeful note given the topic is sometimes so incredibly overwhelming. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
It's great to be with you, Mayor.